from on this particular on the UNG, which is a good way of gauging the natural gas contracts. We went from 11 all the way up to 13. So I would expect a rally in natural gas coming very soon. Now, when we come into gold, gold is had a decent week this past week, but again, it was strictly related to what the central banks did. People, investors are getting nervous and they pour into gold. We looked at the Forex weekly outlook and we anticipate a weaker start to the week and not a great week for metals. And then just like that, a fundamental trumps the very strong technicals. And of course, nobody is able to predict what these central bankers are up to or when they're going to do it, when what they're planning behind closed doors. So even with that, gold has had a bit of a bump. We've got a very loose buy signal here, but it's not a strong one. And if we take the central bank action out of this on Tuesday, gold doesn't look so good. So we want to keep that in mind. And another excellent way of gauging that is, of course, silver. Despite the rally in the equities, silver did not rally. This is a very good indication when we're cross-referencing the different markets to each other that it's unlikely the equities have any real upside potential here because silver is not following it. Gold tends to go on its own, but silver has been following the S&P 500 very, very closely, and you can see that it's basically sitting flat. So after such a rally in the commodities this week, silver did nothing, next to nothing. So we definitely want to keep that in mind and not to get too aggressive with getting into those metals contracts. Now, when we look at light sweet crude oil, again, as light sweet crude oil falls, we will see the natural gas contracts go up. That's the normal correlation there. I know we have higher inventory numbers on natural gas, but we are coming into heating season, and these things change very quickly. I can see crude oil moving lower. My bias is still lower. We can see the spike that I talked about in last week's Forex weekly outlook with the inventory numbers, big candle up, always followed by a big candle right back down again. And this is another example, much like what the central banks have done this past week, is that once the news wears off, the market continues in the direction it was going prior to that. So crude oil not making any new highs this week. Certainly you can see nothing overly bullish about this. We do have a buy signal, but the other indicators are running flat. So there's some divergence there. My opinion is crude oil not pushing above that 103 is another bearish signal. Looking at cross-referencing that to what's happening in the equity markets. The oil follows the equity markets. We have a huge rally, 60-point rally in the S&P 500, and crude oil does nothing, next to nothing. So again, not overly bullish, and when we cross-reference the multiple markets to each other, it doesn't bode well for the S&P 500 or crude oil. When we look at the 10-year Treasury notes, they're coming under pressure. In my opinion, this is another indication that we could start seeing the dollar continue its rally after a little bit more of a corrective move. The dollar starts to rally again, but we do need to keep an eye on these 10-year notes. Now, again, when we're coming into our currency pairs, we're starting with Aussie US. A lot of this is going to look very repetitive because they're all based around risk on, risk off. This is a risk on, risk off currency. Aussie US, one of the biggest one. It's had the strongest rally out of all the commodity currencies this past week, but we have still been unable to get a triple EMA cross on this. And if we look at the long-term crossover from Vantage Point, it's crossed over, but we've done this in overbought territory. The predicted differences are telling me that we're coming lower. So we're going to probably get a little bit more of a bump higher, and then we're going to start selling off again. Not a strong buyer of the Aussie this coming week. When we look at the Euro Swiss franc, I've worked that in as a major pair because it does matter. We're running flat. I do see this as a good long in this 122, anywhere above 121. Anywhere above 120 for that matter. 121.50 is somewhat of a critical area though for me, but we are basically running flat, and then of course with the euro being under pressure. Looking at the British pound dollar this week, we can see that even though the big rally, the risk on rally, The British the sterling comes up, banging up against the Vantage Point predicted moving averages, breaching them slightly, but again you can see this thing rolling over short yet again. So we've got some key levels: 156.84, 156.21, 156.29 with a close of 156.06. Again, this is not a bullish call here on the pound. It still remains bearish. We've closed below all three of those Vantage Point predicted moving averages, and we're starting to turn lower on the indicators yet again. This is a classic signal that I look for on the predicted MACD, the blue line coming up against the black line, running flat, and then turning away from it to the downside. The likelihood that this trend, the downtrend, the primary trend, is going to resume is very, very strong. So to start the week, we would be looking to sell sterling dollar into strength. Euro US, pretty much the same play. I've told my own clients I've got some other resistance here too, towards that 138 level. I don't know if we're going to get that high. The euro is likely to have a little bit of a rally going in. Again, it's buy the rumor, sell the fact. Always keep that in the back of your mind. The politicians are going to throw a lot at you this week. They're going to say that everything is fine in the Eurozone, everything is fine in the global financial markets. I don't think there's an intelligent person on this earth that would buy into that foolishness. Everything is not fine in Europe. Everything is not fine in the U.S. And it's certainly not fine in the financial markets. So this has been a very successful trade, selling into strength. However, again, I've recommended longs to my own clients, and I've done a few long counter trend longs myself during the week, but I'm quick to get that profit off the table in the same day. I'm not interested in holding Euro US longs. So keep that in mind. Right now, Vantage Point providing some pretty decent resistance.